Hi, everybody. Happy Saturday night. Is anybody out there? Anyway, I'm about to start. I thought it would be very good to decompress a little from the day by trying to get some perspective on the conference thus far. I realize that I have to show myself now. No, thanks, Mark. Hi, Darlene. Hi, Kathy. Hi, Gray. Okay, so the first maybe two and a small portion days of the conference now are over. Of course, I'm talking about the MMT International Conference, the first MMT International Conference, I might add. The first but 2 days are over. For me, it was a rather intense 2 days. I had the role of commenting on the many, many live streams that we did. And so I did that, and I was constantly commenting very, very, very fast and trying to give a running commentary on the presentations that were given. Hi, Aaron, how are you? Hi, Lynn. And so I did that, and sometimes I got very invigorated. Sometimes I just ran out of steam and I got very tired. But here I am, it's the end of the second day, and hey, I've had some dinner recently, and I feel good, and I'm ready to go again. So what I wanted to do tonight was to get some perspective on the conference thus far, and also to get your impressions of the conference, and also to get in a lot of questions and answers for those of you who still had some questions about certain things. What I wanted to begin with in giving my impressions about the conference is how incomplete our evaluations have to be right now. Hi, Trish, how you doing? And so, why incomplete? Well, because of necessity. We could only live stream one of the shows at a time. And the number of panels was rather awesome for a conference that was attended by roughly 220 people. And there were often 3 panels going on at once. Sometimes there were 4 events going on at once. And it was very difficult in certain instances to make a choice. And also, it was the kind of conference where you really wanted to see most of the events, but really had to severely pick and choose. And certainly we had to choose very, very carefully about what we wanted to live stream. Joy asks me, aren't we sharing Joe? And the answer is yes, we are. You are supposed to be sharing Joe, but you might have missed that. Okay, so the point being that after the first event on Thursday, on Wednesday night, was it Wednesday night? I'm sorry, no, on Thursday night, which was the reception dinner the talk by Warren Mosler and the entertainment event afterwards, what we saw was basically light entertainment and all of our people getting to the event and everybody extremely happy, really, I'd say thrilled, okay, and awed at being right next to their heroes and being able to talk to them and to get to know them and talk to one another. It was a wonderful meetup. And the Real Progressives group had a really fine time with it, I think. They had a fine time seeing each other, and I think many were meeting for the first time physically. So that was a wonderful thing. And you could see the joy on everyone's face and the kick, okay, that everybody was getting out of it. And that was really, it was great for the people who were looking on. I wasn't able to make it to this conference, but I was very pleased that so many were, and that so many were enjoying it so much on that first night. Okay, and Warren gave one of his characteristic speeches, very, very informal, really cool. His temperament is really unflappable, okay, and cool. And Stephanie gave a great introduction, actually giving some quizzes to people. And the first ones to come up with the right answer got a free book. And they gave out one of Randy's early books on monetary theory and the 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds were given to many people, hard copies of those. I hope they were autographed by Warren. That would have been a very, very nice touch, I think. I'm not sure whether they were, but I'm sure the people who got those books were thrilled to get them. And I'm not sure, I thought maybe Steve got one. It certainly seemed like he came out first with an answer. That is, the question was, I forget exactly what the question was, but the answer was Beardsley Rummel. And there was Steve right out front there, but quick as can be, shouting Beardsley Rummel. So if he got a book out of that, then I'm sure that he's thrilled with it. Anyway, Warren was very, very good in his speech and very entertaining, and I think everybody was thrilled by it. So that first night was a wonderful success, and Steve did a live stream after the show, expressing how thrilled he was and how happy he was. And I was very, very glad to see that. Now, the first day started off with a bang, but what I want to do here is to give you an impression of the first of the panels in the time slot, okay, from 8:30 to 10. There was the panel we live streamed, not surprisingly. The Job Guarantee Design and Human Rights panel. The moderator of that panel was Susan Feiner of the University of Southern Maine, who's written a little bit about MMT, and who got to moderate. And the presenters were David Stein, okay, of UCLA, historian, who gave, I thought, a very excellent presentation on the emphasis in the civil rights movement on the need for a job guarantee, going back to A. Philip Randolph, actually beginning in the 1930s, if I recall correctly, but going right on through the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 1960s, and the emphasis of the Kings, Martin Luther King and also Coretta Scott King, on the job guarantee continuously. The need for a job guarantee was emphasized not only by Martin, but also by Coretta Scott King from the time of Martin's death, until she died. She carried the torch for a job guarantee, or as then was called, an employer of last resort program. So this really touched me a lot, because I was somewhat active in the civil rights movement in the 1960s and always a strong supporter of the civil rights movement. And I identified very strongly with Martin Luther King, and even to some extent with Malcolm X, during the struggles of the 1950s and the 1960s, and also going forward. It was kind of touching for me to hear him go through the history and to go through the political pressure constantly placed to try to get something like a job guarantee by certain black leaders down through the years. And then there was Pavlina, who gave a wonderful presentation on the job guarantee and how it ought to be designed. And Mark Paul, of Duke University, and Jonathan Kroc, of Leiden University, as well. They gave some talks on the job guarantee that were very favorable and very sympathetic, but they didn't have the kind of focus Pavlina had. The laser-like focus on the MMT job guarantee. And I must confess that watching and commenting on that particular session in the conference, I wish that there would have been a number, of MMTers there at that first panel, going right out there and talking about the various aspects of the job guarantee. I wish there had been that, but I was still thrilled by the first panel and thrilled by Pavlina's presentation. However, of necessity, we who concentrated on that panel had to miss two other panels that promised to be very fine. One was moderated by Ellis Scharfenecker, of UMKC, and the presenters were Steve Roth, who is, I believe, one of the publishers, of Economics, and also someone who frequently writes for Economics. I wouldn't characterize him as an MMTer necessarily, but certainly someone who is very knowledgeable about MMT and who is very friendly to MMT, and who might, for all I know, characterize himself as an MMTer. He did a talk on MMT and the Wealth of Nations, sectoral balances meet balance sheets, and he was very well qualified to give that talk. I've read a considerable amount of his stuff, and he knows that inside out. And it would have been very nice to see and hear his talk. And also Brian Romanchuk of bondeconomics.com and the Modern Money Network, I believe, also talked about his Python SFC models framework, which I believe is a simulation framework for sectoral financial balances. And from what I know, of Python and its applicability to mathematical models and to system dynamics, I suspect that's quite a framework. I haven't looked into it myself, but I would have been very fascinated to have seen his particular presentation. I have a feeling that his simulations using that in future years are going to be very, very significant for the development of MMT theory and practice. Then there was Oleg Ivanets of the University of Hawaii at Manoa, which is the main campus of the University of Hawaii, and a beautiful place. I was there myself first summer in 1968 to do some research, and I treasure the memory. It's a wonderful place to be. And he did something on the macroeconomic impact of financial systems development, systemic risk, and economic growth. And that sounds like that would have been a wonderful topic also. And then also Jacob Assa of the United Nations Development Program. He did something on leverage growth towards a stock flow consistent measure, of output. MMT models, of course, are stock flow consistent. And that's why that paper was very relevant to the conference. And I'm sure that it was quite an interesting one. And that panel as a whole would have been of enormous interest for someone who had an interest in the more formal aspects, of MMT. But that particular panel also underlined how this was in large part a conference for MMT researchers and, shall we say, practitioners, maybe developers is a better word, that this was at bottom a professional economics conference rather than an applied MMT conference in terms of a conference that was focused on policy. But then the next panel was on applying MMT. The moderator, was Matthew Bowes, of Bloomberg. Thank you, Aaron, for letting me know that earlier today. And the presenters were Giacomo Bracci. I presume it's pronounced that way, who was presented by Warren Mosler. And the title of that panel was Taxation and the Non-Neutrality, of Money. And then Daniel Bascu of REIT MMT Italia gave a paper on full employment and price stability, the state's impossible rationality, ? And of course, full employment with price stability has been one of the goals of the MMT framework, or two of the goals of the MMT framework, the balance between the two, is one of the goals since the beginning, of MMT. Linwood Tauhi of UMKC, who I presume is a graduate student, gave a paper on MMT and development. That was probably a very general view of development. I would guess more theoretical, than anything else. And then there was another panel by Panagiotis. I'm sorry, another talk by Panagiotis Giannokouros of Mary Baldwin University. And Liwat Chen of James Madison University on the place of econometrics, in MMT. Now, I don't know if I would characterize that panel by its title, of applying MMT. It doesn't seem quite, to apply MMT, though there was one paper on full employment and price stability. But once again, that underlines the strong focus of the conference on the professional field, of economics. I don't want this to be taken as a criticism, but just as an observation, as part of, the impressions that I had at the conference at large. In the second round of panels from 10:30 to 12 a.m. on Thursday dealt with modern money courts and civil rights against legal predation. And I won't go through the makeup, of that panel, because I see already that if I go through the makeup, of many panels, all the panels here in this conference will be here till 3 in the morning, and I don't want to do that. I want to get into the Q&A as quickly as I can. So the point is, there was the relationship, of modern money to courts and to civil rights. Nothing, though, in relation to an agenda, a policy agenda for this particular area. The next panel was on MMT and real-world financial markets, and that was a panel on how MMT related to financial practitioners. Now, from the beginning, financial practitioners have had a great interest, in MMT. Why? Well, because Warren Mosler is a financial practitioner, very well known, and he would also keep on writing about financial practices all during this time. So that's one area of application, of MMT. That is a favorite area. And so that was represented here at the conference in this second round of panels from 10:30 a.m. to 12 p.m. on Thursday. And that was a panel full of practitioners, no academics. The panel following that, which was the one that we covered, was a panel called Pedagogy and Heterodox Economics. And that was organized by the Gonzaga Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, and all the people on that panel were from the Institute or had affiliations with the Institute. The moderator was John Henry, whose work I don't know. The presenters were Ben Wilson from SUNY Cortland and the Gonzaga Institute, and Mitch Green, who used to be the person who did the editing and posting, okay, blog posts, okay, New Economic Perspectives, for about a year when I was blogging there, and who is a really, really nice guy. And after he got his PhD, he went to work for the Bonneville Power Administration, and he's also affiliated with the Gonzaga Institute. Now, he and Ben Wilson, it turns out, are writing a book together. Okay, and that book is concerned with the teaching, okay, of MMT. Also, Yan Liang is involved in the teaching, okay, of MMT at her university. Okay, she's at the Willamette University, which I believe is out in Oregon, and she is in a department that has a lot of neoclassicals in it, but people who are open to change, evidently. And so she gets a chance to include some heterodox perspectives in her teaching. And she had some very interesting things to say about that. And Stephen Hale came from the University, okay, of Adelaide, talk about his experiences in trying to teach MMT in a hostile environment, and how he tries to get around the hostile environment. And Fadel Kaboub talked about his experiences, okay, at Denison in teaching MMT, where he has a pretty free hand to teach it. And that panel turned out to be a very, very fascinating panel in terms of how you operate if you adhere to a new paradigm, how you manage to teach that new paradigm to students, or write in terms of the new paradigm, while also doing it with a care towards fitting the students to fit into a discipline, so that you have to present the old ideas from the new discipline, so that the old ideas, that is, the neoclassical ideas, so people understand these ideas, so they can answer questions about it, so that they not only know the flaws, but know the old paradigm inside out. So for one thing, they can get jobs, but for another thing, they can teach their students the old paradigms, while at the same time teaching them the new paradigm. And the various compromises that our friends in this panel had to make in order to cope with their jobs and cope with life was a theme of the panel. And the need to be honest and not to be deceptive and not to hide things was a theme of the panel as well. And the way that played out in the thinking of the panelists was very, very interesting to see. It didn't have much to do with policy, didn't have actually much to do, okay, with activism. But for somebody like me, who was involved in teaching for many, many years, and involved in teaching both at the graduate level and the undergraduate level, and then involved in research, okay, for many, many years, it was very interesting to hear the dynamics being played out in the work of our panelists. They all gave presentations that were pretty fair. Stephen Hale's was very, very good, and Fadel's was really excellent. Oh, Fadel Kaboub was really, really excellent in his presentation. But even more interesting was the Q&As that came out at that panel. the people attending that panel in the audience included, well, I noticed Randy Ray, Lord Skidelsky, Paul Davidson, very huge names, okay, in economics, who were attending that panel. And I'm sure I missed one or two big names, but those three were sitting very close together. And it was clear that they had an abiding interest in what the Young Turks on the panel had to say about teaching the old school economics and trying to teach the new paradigm too. It was also clear that some of the older people had, shall we say, more sympathy for some aspects of the older paradigm. So that was very fascinating to see and very fascinating to hear. And I was really glad we covered it. That said, the other two panels were of enormous interest as well. And of course, we didn't get a chance to cover those. So at lunch, Jamie Galbraith gave a keynote speech. And Jamie, if you've never seen him speak, he is an elegant speaker. And he is an elegant person. He's extremely courteous to everyone. He is just a wonderful person. And he's an incredible economist as well. He inherited his father's capability in great measure. In great measure. If you've read any of his books, they are fine books. And his commitment to the truth and to making things better has been quite consistent, okay, throughout his life. And when he gives a speech, you can see the integrity shining through, and the courtesy, and the commitment to progressivism. So that speech was a very, very fine speech. And I'm sure thrilling for those who were there. So then there were the panels from 2 to 3:30 p.m. And there were three of those again. There was a panel on towards the 21st century brain trust, the role of lawyers, okay, in MMT. I think that has to be a really big role. This was a central panel, but it was a hard choice, and we chose not to cover it. The moderator was Bill Black, okay, my editor for a while, okay, at New Economics Perspectives blog. Susan Eldridge asks, is Jamie Galbraith an MMT economist? I would say no, because for various reasons of his own, I don't think that Jamie has ever fully supported the job guarantee. On the other hand, if there is anybody who has supported the MMT narrative in getting out there more strongly than Jamie Galbraith, then I don't know who it can be. Because I think, I have a hunch very, very strongly that a big reason why Stephanie Kelton got to be the chief economist of the budget committee, and later the minority chief economist, was due to the support over some period of time of Stephanie that came from Jamie, who I believe has been fairly close to Bernie for years, and even though he's a professor at University of Texas, has a farm in Vermont. And he has known Bernie for years, and I'm sure dealt with him for years. And I think that when Bernie wanted to constitute his dream team, okay, of economists, back in, I think it was in 2013 or 2012, there were all the economists were progressive economists, but there were three MMTers, as I recall, Stephanie, Randy, and Bill Black. Okay, and there was a fourth person very close to MMT, and that was Jamie Galbraith. And I think Jamie was the broker who got the MMTers on Bernie's team. Okay. And I think when the time came for appointing the chief economist, there was probably some conversation around who would be the chief economist, and that the group probably decided that the candidate who would be most available to do that would be Stephanie Kelton. And I believe, and I have no inside information on that except my own knowledge of the context, I believe that's what led to her appointment and all that has come from it since then. So anyway, okay, so Bill Black was the moderator of this panel on the role of lawyers, okay, in MMT, and Robert Hockett of the Cornell Law School was on the panel, and also Martin McCluskey of the University of Buffalo Law School, and Raul Carrillo of the New Economy Project and the Modern Money Network, who's a young lawyer very much involved, okay, in MMT, who's written and published articles in major popular outlets concerning MMT. A very, very good guy and very, very active guy. Okay, and so I'm sure they had a wonderful discussion, and I'm sorry that I was not there to see it, but there was a panel on modern money and the humanities at the same time, moderated by Matt Forstater, one of the original MMTers of the UMKC and the Gonzaga Institute. He's the director of research at the Gonzaga Institute. Fadel is the director of the Institute in general, and Fadel was Matt's student. Okay, so anyway, among the presenters were William Sass, who in the panel got referred to, okay, as Billy Sass, from Louisiana State University and the Gonzaga Institute, gave a paper on rhetorical studies, okay, at MMT. Scott Ferguson, who we know from his comments, okay, in various groups, is from the University of South Florida and the Gonzaga Institute. And he did a very interesting presentation on maintenance art and on modern money and the future of the aesthetic, which was very eloquent. But I thought, okay, I thought a little bit on the abstract and flowery side, so that it was a little hard to follow to get to the main point. Anyway, Maximilian's EO of the University of South Florida gave, I thought, an excellent presentation on From Frater to Hitler, Chartlism, and Weimar film aesthetics, outlining the role of the forerunner, okay, of neoliberalism, and the conflict with Chartists, well, actually with socialists, that contributed very much to the rise of Hitler in Germany. And the presentation was also a bit of a speculation on what might have happened if Chartism had been more prominent at the time and was able to give politics in the Weimar Republic a further alternative, so that the rise of Nazism was headed off even before it was able to take root in Germany. And that was, I thought, a very fascinating paper. Also, Louisa Connors wrote a paper co-authored with Bill Mitchell. Okay, but Bill did not say anything about the paper. Actually, I think they did a novel together. But the paper was on macroeconomics and popular culture, and it was entitled The Mandelbills Discover MMT, and I didn't quite catch the narrative. The sound quality was not very good, and that coupled with the delivery of Louisa Connors, and also noise in the room and the microphones, it all conspired to make it very hard to understand the presentation. And there was nothing wrong, of course, with her speech, okay, in Australian accent. They were fine, and under better conditions, it would have been very, very easy to understand. But in those conditions, you missed keywords and phrases. So while the message came through to people in the room who seemed to very much enjoy the presentation, I think it was hard for people who were getting the videos to really get it all. And that then sort of detracted from what might have been a very fascinating talk. So I think this panel was a very, very good one from the standpoint of giving a humanities perspective on MMT. And so it was very, very good to see it. But it must have been a hard choice for Steve to make, to decide to concentrate on that panel rather than the other two. The third one was on MMT in a global context. And the moderator was, again, Matthew Bowes of the Bloomberg organization. And, okay, I'm not going to go through the presenters, but the papers looked like they were very fascinating and gave a good perspective, okay, on MMT in a global context. So again, all three panels looked like they would have been fascinating to attend. We, however, had to concentrate, okay, on only one of them, and therefore the RP people who were looking at the live streams weren't able to get the full impact. Now we'll be able to get it over time because the videos will be up, okay, and that will be very, very good. But for now, I'm sure we've missed a lot of the impact. On Friday, no, I'm sorry, this was actually, okay, I guess I was on Friday. Right, this was still Friday. I haven't gotten to Saturday yet. Okay, from 350 to 520, there were again some very interesting panels. One was on modern money and interest rates, okay, and credit, and Matt Bowes also moderated that as well. Isn't this the third one moderated by Matt Bowes? Well, all right. Paul Davidson was a presenter on that one. And also Eric Batimwanya, who in my view is a real comer in the MMT world. He got his PhD a few years back, and he does formal work and theoretical work and studies of the banking system, and his knowledge of the banking system rivals the knowledge, okay, any of the MMTers, okay, in my view. And I've gotten a chance to see him, okay, in other contexts. I was sorry not to be able to see him, okay, in this context, because I think he would have been wonderful in this particular panel. But it was very hard for us to choose this panel, and the reason why was because there was a panel on the MMT University and the new MMT Macroeconomics textbook. It's a panel given by Bill Mitchell and Martin Watts and Randy Ray, the co-authors of the MMT Macroeconomics textbook. And they gave a fascinating discussion, okay, again, focusing around the compromises they had to make in the textbook involving giving rather full background on neoclassical economics while trying to transition people to the MMT paradigm, and how the textbook had to be good enough in the neoclassical details to fit people for the environments that they were going to enter at some later time. And also the difficulty they had in writing a textbook that could be used for introductory classes, for more advanced classes, and even for graduate school. But this is the first full detail MMT textbook, and given the authors, it promises to be a wonderful, wonderful textbook. And for those who wanted to see this panel, it was, I'm sure, very, very hard to make the choice to go and see this panel, but it was really an unavoidable choice, I think, for most of us who know anything of the background of the textbook. And the discussion of it, again, was well worth it. They went through a lot of the same issues that were covered in the morning panel with the younger Turks, but with perhaps a little bit of additional perspective provided by some of the older MMTers, very, very concerned with making the transition in a way that fits the people who learn the new paradigm to their environment. So it was fascinating, really, to hear them talk about that and to hear them go through the book and go through the contents and explain why different chapters focused on different things and what those things were. And they did this for an hour and a half, and it was fascinating. It was excellent. Then there was a panel on practical applications of geographic information systems to regional disparities, okay, an MMT approach. And that was very interesting. There were a number of very, very good people on that particular panel. Neil Wilson from England was one of the participants. I haven't really known Neil to write much about geographic information systems and regional disparities. but he's well known to me as someone who writes very frequently about the job guarantee and very well about the job guarantee. Now, normally these days, he writes about it on the Medium blog, but his writing is always unfailingly clear and very eloquent, okay, in many cases, and I recommend his writing to you. And I was sorry to have missed that panel just because I would have liked to have seen Neil give a presentation. At the reception and dinner on Friday, Jan Kriegel, okay, of Bard College, also one of the original MMTers, gave a very, very interesting talk in which he contended that there was a way to introduce the origins, okay, of money as possibly coming not from a chartalist point of view, but from a private money point of view, in such a way that the government did not have to be involved, okay, and in a narrative that only later would bring in the government as just another kind of issuer of credit and money. And that was interesting because Jan explained how that could be done in such a way as to approach the Austrian economists better and those who disbelieved in the state theory of money in a better way, but in such a way that it would allow one to arrive at the MMT principles anyway. And in the aftermath of his talk, which was again a little bit difficult to understand because of the quality of the sound coming from the microphones and his particular pattern of speech, and again, I don't know that it would have been hard to understand it if one were there in the hall, but it was difficult for people to understand who were looking at it on a live stream feed. Okay, and anyway, I'm not sure I got the whole of his rationale about how this worked, but it created a very interesting back and forth between he and Warren Mosler during the Q&A period. They went back and forth 5 or 6 times, with Warren contending that there was no way the state could not be involved in the origins, okay, and Jan trying to answer Warren. And I must confess that I'm still not sure who had the better of that argument, but I was conscious of the fact that it was difficult for Warren, being a questioner out in the audience, rather than a panelist arguing against the particular point of view, okay, of Jan. But just because with Jan being on the podium, he could dismiss certain of Warren's points in a relatively short way that he would not have been able to do had this been a panel discussion. And so I would have been interested in seeing a debate between the two on this in a panel context, and I look forward perhaps to seeing that one day. So after that speech, the people adjourned for music and dance, okay, and drink. And Steve gave another live stream, but last night, which was right on and again reflected his happiness at being involved in the whole thing, and his encouragement at seeing so many people there, and his in that particular live stream, he went through how we had to look for other ways to get into MMT through other policy openings, such as student loan debt and sustainability. In other words, talking policy first and then finding your way to MMT. It seemed to me he was implying that rather than starting off with taxes don't fund spending, we maybe start off with policies and get to MMT at some later point. Actually, I quite frequently do that, as when I'm giving a talk on, on Medicare for All or something like that. Then I start talking about the details of the Medicare for All program, and MMT comes in relation to talking about whether we can afford it or how we can pay for it, okay, and stuff like that. So now here we are on Saturday, and we have the opening panel from 8:30 to 10 a.m., one of the outstanding panels of the conference, where the moderator was Jeff Spross of The Week, who has written a number of good articles, okay, at MMT, the latest being on the job guarantee, and that was really a very, very excellent article in the Week magazine, where he's a regular columnist. And the panelists were Stephanie Kelton, Bill Mitchell, Warren Mosler, and Randy Ray. And so you couldn't have a more high-powered panel, okay, than that. Again, that panel was marred by the weakness of the sound quality and the passing back and forth of the microphones, because one or two of the microphones went out, okay? So that was detracting from the time which the panelists had. And but while sometimes it was hard to understand the panelists, probably least hard to understand what Randy Ray had to say and what Warren had to say. It was a little more difficult to understand Stephanie and Bill's remarks. Were most difficult because often Bill is very quiet and gentle in his speech, belying how forceful that speech happens to be and how direct. This actually was no exception. If you look at my running commentary for the panel, which we covered, okay, at RP in the stream, you'll see how forward Bill was in stating his impressions. When it came to discussing the job guarantee versus the basic income, here Bill was extremely forthright, calling the basic income a scam to continue to tie us to a neoliberal approach to economics. Interestingly, Warren's opposition to basic income was not as strong as it was back in, I believe it was in 2012, if I recall correctly, in the job guarantee series, the job guarantee in the MMT core that I wrote, okay, at that time, and that you'll find at the Current Wire site. Okay, I did a series, it was a blog series of 16 installments at that time, And a number of the installments involved things that Warren had to say about the job guarantee. And at that time, he didn't seem to be very tolerant of the idea of a JIG, that is, a job and income guarantee. In other words, both with a gap between the income guarantee and job guarantee in terms of the money involved. And I was contending for that at that time. And Warren was being pretty firm about his ideas that we only needed a job guarantee, okay, and not an income guarantee. So since that time, evidently, Warren has moved a little and now says that maybe having an income guarantee in the context of having a job guarantee would be okay for the economy. So there were a number of other MMTers who argued that from time to time. Okay, I forget now. Okay, if Randy did, if he came around to that, but Pavlina was with that idea fairly early on. It did not bother her to have an income guarantee as long as the job guarantee was there as well in the context. Because she rightly reasoned, I think, and I think that Warren also did later, that it would be the job guarantee that would be setting the price for labor in that context, and not the income guarantee. So in that context, the income guarantee could not be inflationary, especially since most people would be in the job guarantee and very few in the income guarantee. So the loss of productivity that might be inherent in an income guarantee would not be a factor in that other context. So Warren moved a little, it seems, in his position. But anyway, in spite of the sound difficulties and such, that panel was, of course, a very, very exciting panel to see the four of them together and discussing the very important job guarantee program, okay, of MMT, and hearing the arguments again from them. One problem was there wasn't much time for the Q&A, okay, in that particular panel, because they had to break for the 10:30 panels. And the 10:30 panels, again, we faced a very difficult choice. We decided to live stream the Rohan Gray panel, which had a number of people on it who were very interesting, including Carlos Mucha, the Beowulf, who first came up with the idea of the platinum coin. He's an attorney, and so he was brought in part to discuss the topic of modern money payment systems and digital rights. And so he focused somewhat on the payment systems and somewhat on the fiscal crises, whereas Rohan and Brett Scott focused very much on the new technology, introducing new risks into the monetary system, new risks of stability in the monetary system. Now, Daniela Gabor gave a very fine presentation on shadow banking, because, of course, shadow banking is the source of much risk to the financial system. And she was very, very good at outlining various risks that can arise through shadow banking. And then Rohan and Brett provided a new digital rights and digital technology context to those risks. And I thought they did a very, very good job in suggesting the need for regulations and controls and the importance of putting in regulations and controls. And perhaps even just prohibiting certain kinds of activity, okay, within the monetary area. Though in Rohan's case and in Brett Scott's case also, and also Daniela Gabor had the idea that you can't try to prohibit the private creation of money to combat this because it's just impossible to do so. And what you have to do is try to embrace that this is going to be a fact of life and try to steer that fact of life towards a legitimate use of that money and the removal of risks to the system. They might be right about that, but I found myself unable to reject the possibility that a policy of serial capital punishment for new financial instruments that are constantly invented by the private sector, whether that wouldn't be a better policy to prevent the private sector from creating the kind of money that would be outside, okay, of federal control, and that would represent a risk to the stability of the system. I'm not at all sure that a policy of vigorous capital punishment for new inventions would not be the best way to pursue this over time. Okay. I don't think it's quite analogous to prohibition in the case of alcohol. Primarily because what prohibition was trying to do was to prohibit certain activities that a majority of the population like to engage in from time to time or even very frequently. Whereas when it comes to just creating private money, the main problem is with a relatively few people in the financial sector. So that's a lot less people to control and a lot fewer activities to control than the people who wanted prohibition were facing. But anyway, that's just my judgment of the situation. And I have no idea whether I'm right, okay, or not. But anyway, Rohan's discussion was very, very good, very, very knowledgeable. He's deeply thought about this and very much aware of the problems that arise from it and very much aware of the technical detail. And I think he's closely allied to Brett Scott, who's very knowledgeable in the information technology area, at least very knowledgeable for someone concerned with the financial implications. He gave a later talk, okay, at lunch, in which he talked about the movement of the technology, okay, eventually resulting, okay, in agent-based decision-making that would basically replace the humans, okay, in trading and create an area that absolutely had to be regulated or it would easily result in various disasters for the financial system. Anyway, that panel was very, very fascinating. But The other panels, Matt Forstatter's panel, dealing with MMT and ecological sustainability, that's of course one of the major policy areas of application, okay, of MMT to ecological sustainability. I have to admit I missed one person on this panel, Michael Hexter, who certainly belonged fully on this panel. Okay. However, Mitch Green's background in it is very, very strong. I don't know Philip Lawn's background. I presume it's also very, very strong. And Scott Fulweiler has been working in the area for years now. And Scott is always very strong in his formal approaches. So that would have been something worth attending, of course, but we could not do it. And then finally, Bill Mitchell had a workshop during this period of time on framing MMT. I badly, badly wanted to see that particular workshop. That's just a problem at the forefront of getting MMT accepted and applied to progressive politics. But there was no opportunity to see it because we made the choice of following the Rohan Gray panel. So that was really a set that gave very, very tough choices. It didn't matter really which one you chose of those three. It was going to be the wrong choice, or you were going to feel you were going to have regrets, whatever you chose to attend. So I hope I'm giving the impression now, which is what I'm trying to give, that this was a panel where this was a conference where the panels were of enormous quality and enormous significance in one way or another. And where, if you were a single person going to these panels, you could not see all you wanted to see. It was just impossible. You had to be triplets in certain cases. So now we come to Saturday at 2 o'clock, and there we have a panel on U.S. policy history and the role of the state. And again, that was one I wanted to see. Nathan Tankis, was on it. John Henry was doing something on reflections on the New Deal. And Justin Santopietro, who used to blog over at the Mike Norman blog, and who's a graduate student, I believe, at George Washington now, who's doing something on 4 Decades in Darkness, reforming the U.S. federal budget process. And that, of course, was on the 4 decades since the founding of the CBO and the very, very bad impact that CBO and its neoliberal budget disciplines have had on American politics and on the progressive movement during that period of time. And I'm sure Justin did an excellent job on that particular panel. I know him slightly, and he's a clear thinker, and he would have had a really good time, I think, with that particular subject. There was also a presentation at the same time by the New Democracy Party, An Australian Alternative, Our Journey and Strategy. And that was a workshop about the Australian New Democracy Party. And it had a presenter, Vernon Bakringas, from the party, who was doing the workshop. I kind of looked over at the workshop when I got a free couple of seconds, because we didn't choose to follow that workshop. I just wanted to see how they were doing, and I could tune in for a few seconds on the official feed of the conference rather than the RP feed, that I was following. And I noticed they had only about 3 or 4 people there for the workshop, and I felt really sorry for them. But they were against some really tough competition, because the third workshop was on MMT and the job guarantee in the developing countries. And that had Fadel Kaboub on it, who's just excellent on the job guarantee in a developing context. And Jan Kriegel, who was also very, very excellent on the job guarantee and on the perspective of really getting rid of the distinction between developing economies and the developed economies, on grounds that both the developed economies and the developing economies have trouble keeping their people fully employed, because they're all beset by neoliberal ideology and the consequences of neoliberalism, which prevents the economies from achieving full employment and price stability. He made his case clearly and quite convincingly, and in this case, there was no problem with the microphones. And Yang Liang, I thought, also gave a very good presentation on what's happened in some economies that have used the state to grow rapidly, and in some cases to maintain full employment or low unemployment for a period of time. And she discussed the Japanese case and the Thai case very, very briefly, and in most detail, the China case. And that was a very, very interesting talk, I thought. And Warren Mosler, of course, was his usual really charming and interesting speaker, and also discussant, and very, very good in the Q&A also. And it was just a delight to follow that particular panel. Okay, but again, it was a hard choice with respect to the other panels. And then we had the 350 to 520 period, and there were again 3 panels, and one involved Stephen Hale, who was doing something on do we need a general theory of modern money, well-being, and sustainability. I thought that was a fascinating topic, and I have the intuitive sense that the answer to that question is yes, but I'm not sure Stephen gave that answer because, of course, I didn't get a chance to follow it, but I'm sure he gave a fascinating discussion of that, and I would have liked to have seen it. And then there was another panel on modern money, financial regulation, and corporate power, and the moderator was Nathan Tankus, and the presenters were Lee Shepard of Tax Analysts, okay, and Bill Black. And I'll bet Bill gave a bang up of the presentation on that panel, which was, of course, right up his alley. But we really could not concentrate on that. And the reason was that there was a third panel which covered the Levy Economics Institute report, which is shortly to come out, and this was a preview, which was called A Job Guarantee Proposal for the United States. And the moderator of that panel was Stephanie Kelton, and the panelists were Randy Ray and Pavlina Chernyeva and Scott Fullwiler. And Randy gave a wonderful presentation just citing empirical facts and regression analysis of the results, and also some initial findings of part one of that study, which findings have already come out. Part two, okay, is not out. And Scott's role in this was to do a simulation of the job guarantee using an alternative method to the different methods used by Randy to try to come up, okay, with estimates of what the uptake would be on a job guarantee program if an MMT job guarantee program were passed. And very roughly, Randy's initial findings were that, he gave a range. I forget exactly what the range was, but the headline figure on that was that there were probably 17 million people still left to be employed that would come on to such a program. And I have to say, I think there are at least that. I have to look into the methods and see how they sit with me. But it was clear that Randy used very, very conservative assumptions but I'm not sure in what way they were conservative. But he tried to do the assumptions so that they were not easily picked at as either too optimistic or too pessimistic. Okay. And his was a very good presentation, a very effective one, very clear. And Scott Fullweiler discussed the simulation results, and those were fascinating too. And those were very much in line with Randy's, maybe a little bit higher, maybe a little larger range, so a little bit lower at the bottom, a little bit higher at the top. But 17, 18 million people, okay, a good estimate. And Scott's simulation covered a number of, of variables, including the costs, okay, of such a program. Scott used a model called the FAIR model, which was developed by Ray Fair, Keynesian economists over the years starting in the 1970s. The FAIR model is fair because it was developed by Ray Fair, but it's also fair because that 130 equation model does not have any of the characteristic kinds of neoliberal assumptions in it. It does not assume that there's a loanable funds market out there. It does not incorporate that into the model. It does not incorporate the NAIRU into the model. So for projections, that model is much superior to CBO's modeling of some of the impacts of what government spending, is likely to be. There were assumptions added to this model by Scott, of course, which were designed to allow the simulation of the job market and the likely impact in terms of number of people who would join the job guarantee program if we had one. And a lot of his findings are very illuminating. They'll be coming out in the report. And I had the feeling after they were finished with their presentations that relative to the job guarantee program, that this work was really dynamite. But it was presented in a very low-key way and not with a great deal, of passion, much more in an analytical way. And then Pavlina came on, and I had the sense that what she was going to talk about was the details of the job guarantee program, how it was being designed, and more about how it was going to work, and the areas, okay, of local control, and the participatory and democratic nature of it, the concentration in the nonprofit center. This meshed with some things, okay, Randy had said, because one thing Randy emphasized was that over the years, the capacity to run a job guarantee that exists in the government now was not what it was in the 1970s had we passed one then. Because back in the 1970s, there were economic models like the FAIR model that were very, very good at using indicators and predicting the immediate outcomes of certain of our policies, and very skilled interpreters of those models, okay, implementers of the models. But over the years, under the influence, okay, of neoliberalism, those models are no longer used in government. And the new job guarantee program would not have access to the kinds of controls that a good national program would have on the job guarantee program, which was one reason why the MMTers at present were designing the programs to come under local control, where the impact could be more easily seen, okay, and managed, and which would provide considerable autonomy to the local area. So that tied in with what Pavlina had to say. But the more she said about the design of the job guarantee and how it worked, the more excited she got, and the more excited she got, the more excited people got. And when it finally came time for the Q&As, and she was asked some questions about what things the job guarantee would cover, she just got more and more and more enthusiastic and more expansive. And then there was tremendous passion injected into this panel, which was one of the most exciting of the conference so far. And just a very, very important panel. And all in all, an excellent performance by the panelists. And at 5:20, they had to get out of there, and there was not nearly as much time for discussion as they needed to have. The discussion could have gone on for hours over that, okay? And also, our Melanie Oringer got to ask one of the great questions. She was sitting right in front of the presenters, and she got to ask her question about whether artists, theater people, the writers, the home care people, and the musicians, whether people like that could be included in the job guarantee program as participants. And then Pavlina went off on how she always was designing that to include them from the very, very start. And of course, we've always emphasized here, okay, at RP, that whether they were included or not would be up to the discretion of the local areas and the local nonprofits. So, of course, by and large, they most probably would be included. And Pavlina's answer to that question was just about the end of the whole panel. So it ended on a very, very high note, and people were quite excited when Stephanie had to cut off the discussion. So that was a high point of the conference so far, but unfortunately, we could not sample what Bill had to say. And this evening, there was a talk by Lord Robert Skidelsky, was a very important figure in the development, okay, of MMT, an old Keynesian who has been very supportive, okay, of MMT, and who I believe made a substantial financial contribution to this conference to make it possible to have it. And so he had a conversation with Zach Carter, which we've put online. I haven't had the time to sample that because I had to decompress. I was very tired, okay, by that time, because I'd been doing a running commentary on all the panels, and I needed some rest and I needed some dinner before I began to get ready for this particular broadcast. So summarizing now on my impressions, okay, of the whole thing so far, okay, a lot of it was enormously exciting. And I think I've given you my impressions of the high points in the panels that I got to see, and my regrets about not having seen some of the other points that I think would have been high points. Okay. But I also want to say that from an activist point of view, that this conference was not focused on that for these first two and some part of a day. And there was very little in the way of activism or policy discussed in this. In other words, development policies were discussed, some trade policies were discussed, some financial applications were also discussed, some. But when we go through the various policy areas in a progressive domestic agenda that we would see in the United States, those policy areas were not covered by the economics. What was the title of that panel? The early panel with, I think it was the Jeff Spross panel. Economics for a New Progressive Era. I would have expected from a title like that the economics would have been mentioned, giving a very basic presentation, and then an attempt to relate those economics to all the policy areas of concern for progressives. Okay, but obviously, that was not actually the case here. We had during the panel a great concentration on the MMT job guarantee program, as is appropriate. That's enormously important, even from a progressive standpoint, for a number of other kinds of implications. So I'm very glad they focused on that. But in some of the other policy areas that are so important, student loan debt, the aftermath of the mortgage frauds, the climate change area, and a comprehensive program for climate change, the environment. Yes, there was a panel on ecological sustainability, but there wasn't really that much on sustainability in terms of looking at this as economics for a progressive era. There wasn't much directly on the equality issues. There was hardly anything on Medicare for all, except a comment that was made by Warren, where he suggested that Bernie Sanders' Medicare for all bill might be highly deflationary and a danger to the economy from that point of view. He did not explain really why he thought that. He did not have any modeling results to cite. So it was really just an opinion, okay, at that point, which I've heard him voice also on another occasion. I would like to see an analysis to back that, and even a modeling exercise to back that. But even more than that, I would have liked to have seen in such an MMT program a broader discussion, okay, of a Medicare for All program and how that might be supported under a set of policies that were MMT based. In fact, I wouldn't mind even actually debating Warren on the subject of under what conditions Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All program could be quite stimulative to the economy and the jobs producer. I believe it can be. Of course, the devil, okay, is in the details, and very much in how the Medicare for All program gets funded. But anyway, that remains to be seen. But I missed the discussion of that very important policy now at the forefront, okay, of our concerns. Okay, but more generally, the whole set of policy concerns within a progressive agenda was not well covered in the conference up to this time. And looking ahead until tomorrow, we have another panel on the job guarantee. And Pavlina doing the moderation for that. We have MMT in the streets, where the moderator is Timothy Fong, and the presenters include Steve. Well, of course, we know what we're going to cover. Okay, and that's very good, but that's on grassroots organizing and mass mobilization. Well, that's probably going to focus on the strategy and techniques for mass mobilization, but it probably won't focus on the kinds of policies that could be backed by MMT in some way that would be successful in mobilizing the populations. So then there'd be a third panel. There was going to be a third panel on MMT finance, okay, and interest rate policy. Now, of course, interest rate policy is very relevant to a progressive era, but it's not at the forefront of the progressive issues that form an agenda. That doesn't mean it's not important to talk about it and that it shouldn't be represented here. I think it should. Okay, but what I'm saying is, it's the third day of the conference. Many of the major issues, policy issues we're facing now, where MMT-based policy would have a role, are not yet covered in this conference. Okay, and the panel scheduled for the third day do not suggest that they will be covered in the third day. So my initial impression of after the first two and some part days of the panel is that the various treatments in this panel will not speak to most of the progressive movement because they will be focused mostly on MMT-related issues that are only a small part of the policy concerns of the progressive movement. Now, I go back to recognizing that this was an MMT professional conference. It was a world conference, and it was a conference that had to reflect the primary interests of the MMT practitioners as they exist at present. But what I think I'm saying is that there might have been some panels in this conference that were devoted to attracting people by discussing issues that the progressive movement is discussing every day, and that it seems to me there has been too little of that in the conference, if I'm looking at it from a progressive activist sort of standpoint. And if I'm looking at it even in terms of RP, okay, in terms of RP areas, we have 7 knowledge policy areas that are important, okay, in RP. And this conference seems to deal with 2 of them, leaving a number of them not covered. And I'm looking at this purely from an RP point of view, but also from a broader progressive point of view. I think more has to be done to interest the progressive movement in MMT. And I think it's not just a matter of framing the message properly, or maybe framing the message properly in a proper way involves also discussing many more of the subjects, of the policy subjects that the progressive movement, okay, is interested in. And so, okay, I'll leave my assessment at that for the time being. And I suggest, of course, that everybody tune in tomorrow, because these final panels are going to be wonderful in their way and very, very good to watch. And of course, I recommend specifically the panel Steve is going to moderate, okay, on MMT foundations, and also the earlier panel where Steve is going to present on MMT in the streets, grassroots organizing, and mass mobilization. Tomorrow, the working part of the conference is going to adjourn at 12:15. There'll be a final talk by Warren Mosler at a final lunch from 12:15 to 1:45. So the working part of the conference will be done by 1:45 in the afternoon tomorrow. And so the conference will not take as much time tomorrow. So I'm now ready to entertain any questions or comments you have. Susan Eldridge asks, what time are these panels tomorrow? They begin at 8:30, and then there are 3 panels then, and that's when Steve is on his first panel on MMT in the Streets, a panel that's very well named. And then there are the panels from 10:30 to 12 p.m. So there are 2 rounds, okay, of panels tomorrow. And there's a talk by Warren. So to answer the question directly, there's an 8:30 to 10 panel. There's a 10:30 to 12 panel. Then there's the talk by Warren at 12:15. Well, what panels have I enjoyed the most? Well, I think I gave an indication of that. I enjoyed the last panel on the job report really immensely, but I also enjoyed the pedagogy panels and the textbook panels immensely also. And let's see, looking back at all the panels, okay, I also very much enjoyed the financial panel as well, okay, with Rohan and Brett Scott, Daniela, and also Carlos. I would have enjoyed the economics for a new progressive era more had the sound quality been better. And going back to Friday now, I'm almost all done going back to Friday. I also enjoyed the job guarantee design and human rights panel, which was the first panel, okay, that I attended. I should say attended, that I watched. That was at 8:30 to 10 on Friday. So, Mark asks, 8:30 Central Standard Time, right? 8:30 Central Standard Time. So it's not 8:30 Eastern Daylight Time. It's 9:30 Eastern Daylight Time. Okay, any more questions at this point? Does anybody have any impressions of theirs to offer? Were there any differences in your impressions compared to mine? Okay, Rob Rice says, from my understanding that the job guarantee would be intertwined with non-governmental organizations. I have a huge concern with non-governmental organizations in general because they've gone out of control. And how can we protect ourselves from abuse if the NGOs are involved? I think that's a very good question, but it's not just the NGOs that would be involved. It's the nonprofit organizations. It's the community organizations. It's organizations doing work on community problems each day. they're not all abusive. And I think we have to keep that in mind. When Pavlina was asked a somewhat similar question, she answered, well, of course, in any program, there has to be quality controls. And even though that's a general comment, I don't think it's a brush off. I think that when the job guarantee is finally passed, it's going to be implemented by people who want the job guarantee program to be a success. And they can be trusted to build in criteria and various mechanisms into the administration of the program that will place controls on the nonprofit organizations and the social entrepreneurs. The reason being, it's not even simply just to protect against abuse, but it's also for the reason that we know the rightists are going to be sniping at us from day one if we pass this particular program. And they're going to be inventing stories about fraud and abuse in the program. We certainly don't want to give them any true stories about fraud and abuse in the program, because they're just going to be inventing it wholesale, and we don't need any factual fraud. Just, we're really going to guard against that as best we can. Now, of course, it remains to be seen what the design is going to look like in the actual bill. We have to see that, and then we have to see what the executive's orders are that are going to implement such a bill. But you can be sure that they will be very, very careful about this. And Elizabeth Diaz says Pavlina Chernyeva has been amazing this conference. Yes, she's been amazing this conference, and she's been amazing over the years. She's been committed, and she's been amazing. And these days, I think the job guarantee is more her baby, even, than anybody else's baby. She's just really, really, really strong on this policy, and no compromise on it, with anybody. And Tanya Carla says, urgency in and on policy, Steve and I share that. Yes, and I share it with you too, Tanya. I share it with you as well. And Nerman Atkins says, well, there's no quality control on Monsanto genetically modified foods. And he talks about there being 501c3 tax exempt fraud involved for Monsanto profits. Well, I have a hunch that that's very true. I don't know about this in detail, but I know enough about the GMOs, and I know quite enough about the perversion of the nonprofit system in recent years to suspect that that is very true. All again, I can tell you is that there are people in the MMT camp very experienced at ferreting out and preventing fraud. They have been prevented in recent years from entering the government. Specifically, Bill Black is a case in point. But under a government that would be friendly to MMT, people like this would be getting into the government, people who are not afraid to prosecute, convict, and imprison the fraudsters. And in such an administration, there would be a lot of that going on. A lot of that going on. Tanya thanks me. I'm not going to post thanks, but she says the roundup was very great and comprehensive. I'm not sure I really intended such a comprehensive roundup. I just got to talking, and you know when I get to talking how I am. I just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. Okay, especially when people are willing to ask me questions. Okay, and to listen. And Mark Collins asks, will the UMKC videos be available to the public? I think they were arranged by the Modern Money Network, and my understanding is yes, there will be official versions that will be available to the public. I don't know whether they'll be available in whole or in part, or maybe both, but they're certainly going to be made available and will be a centerpiece of future considerations of MMT over the next year and beyond. I have no doubt about that. So we will see those. Kai Sexton said, I already did a thorough treatment, okay, of Medicare for All, and he thanks me. I tried to do a thorough treatment, but when Warren Mosler says that that's likely to be deflationary and to cost jobs, specifically the Sanders program, then even though I don't know how he got to that opinion, I know him too well and have known him and his writings for too many years to take such an opinion lightly or with sanguinity. I would really like to know his thinking about that. Okay, because when it comes to the intuitive impact that MMT-based policy is likely to have on the economy, there's no one whose intuitive understanding of what is going to happen as a result of such a policy that is better at that kind of intuition than Warren. Now, that intuition may be second-guessed, of course, by formal modeling efforts, by econometric studies, by facts, okay, that are brought to the table. And Warren is perfectly capable of changing his opinion in face of those, but those do not now exist. And based on his track record, you have to wonder whether the best judgment concerning inflationary impact that we have today actually comes from Warren. I mean, I'm perfectly willing to debate him and to see what he has to say, okay, about impact on that. But if I were a betting man, I would not bet against his opinion in this instance. That's why I'm so much in favor of detailed consideration of his views and hearing it all out. Mark Fabian says, too bad they didn't have enough time for questions and to give more examples of the jobs that could be created by an FJG. Yeah, it is really too bad, but I'm reminded of a post by Neil Wilson, a recent post, okay, in Medium, that argued that in the nature of the case, we cannot know what jobs are going to be created in an MMT program now, okay, because it would be like not knowing what kinds of jobs will be created in the private sector in the coming years. That is, the private sector is always inventing new jobs. And what he calls the social value sector, including the activities of the nonprofits and the social entrepreneurs, we cannot know any better what jobs will be created in that social value sector than we can know about what jobs will be created in the private the market value sector. And I think he's right about that. We cannot know what jobs will be created, if only because of the advance of technology. Because while technology is going to remove many sorts of jobs from the private sector, it might well enhance and create entirely new jobs within the social value sector that we haven't thought through yet. So I'm sure we can come up with all kinds of examples of things we can do today in a job guarantee program. But I'm also sure that that would not begin to cover the waterfront in terms of new jobs that will be invented in that social value sector when we have the backing of a job guarantee program at a living wage. Now, by the way, the MMT proposal today for such a program in the job guarantee report did adapt a job guarantee wage of $15 per hour as the living wage. I don't know if that involved any regional cost adjustments or whether that's flat across the country. If it's flat across the country, then I would oppose that. I think regional cost adjustments in the job guarantee program are essential to create a level playing field and make the wage truly a living wage. And if it's going to be local community based especially, I think there has to be those regional cost adjustments. I would also favor $18 an hour over $15 an hour, but that's a discussion for another day. Okay, Nerman Odkan says, I am a she and an artist and activist speaking out against 501c3 fraud. Citizens United corporations within the Supreme Court, okay, are privatized. There's a lot that can be done about Citizens United without passing a constitutional amendment. But what can be done relies on our gaining control of Congress. Okay. Specifically, what a Congress that we control can do is it can pass new campaign financing laws prohibiting in various ways contributions by corporations, even just by passing a national law redefining what it means to be an artificial person, thus invalidating the finding of the Supreme Court that corporations are entitled to the protections of the Bill of Rights. Now, you might ask, how would such a law be constitutional in the face of a review by the Supreme Court? It would be constitutional because Congress, according to, I believe it's, I forget if it's a particular section of Article 3 or Article 1, Section 3, I can look it up. there's a provision in the Constitution that gives the Congress the authority to specify the jurisdiction that certain appellate courts will have to review laws. The Supreme Court is an appellate court. It's the highest appellate court. And Congress has the authority to specify in a law with a simple sentence that the Supreme Court shall not have the authority to review this law, thus removing the possibility of appeals to the Supreme Court to rule that law as unconstitutional. Okay, now eventually and clearly, we will have to have a constitutional amendment which can outlast changes in politics, which put the corporates of both parties, in power once again. But if we ever gain power, I suggest that the first thing we should do is get rid of the possibility of corporate contributions to political activity of any way, of any kind. Simply prohibit it, and do so by first defining away the personhood of corporations under the Constitution. It's very clear that the founders did not intend to create corporations as persons. That was something that came into the law through judicial review by the Supreme Court in the 1880s. Okay, we can get rid of that with a simple law prohibiting the Supreme Court from reviewing that law. That is what we need to do while we await the passage of a constitutional amendment. So, Ms. Odkan, that is my answer to your question. Okay? I hope you liked it. I have a blog or two on that, by the way, in Correnti Wire somewhere. Daniel Goheen asks, so how do we make these jobs good jobs all around so it's not just something actually turns in activity benefiting, like how the 1%, how do we make this actuality? What is training for jobs? People do things, people don't have skills. And what about how do we make it to where there's a good paying job? Seems like ever since the 80s, since Ronald Reagan destroyed a good amount of unions in the country, weight loss, good paying jobs are settling for us, and they should be settling. Not sure I understand that particular question, but the jobs in the job guarantee program will be defined by the community organizations for the purpose of producing social and public value as defined by the community organizations. So they will be jobs that will be producing value for the economy and for the community. They will not be jobs that will be focused on producing value for a specific set of individuals the people are working for. Okay? They won't be working for private companies anyway, except for the social entrepreneurial companies that will be fulfilling public purpose functions as judged by local community authorities and as reviewed also by the national government. So that's how we make these good jobs. What are good jobs? in this context, good jobs are jobs that have social value and that the individuals want to do. In other words, where the working conditions are good enough that the individuals receive job satisfaction from working at these jobs. So Ms. Otkin asks, how long does it take to pass those laws? Citizens United was assumed in 2010. Corporations have the same rights as individuals. First Amendment right on the first fact. Yeah, they do have the same rights, okay, as individuals. I just told you, I don't know whether you asked this question before I gave my answer to the last question, but I just told you how these rights can be taken away in a way that the Supreme Court can do nothing about. Okay. So we can take away these rights, but we have to win a big election. I mean, we have to overcome the voter suppression, okay, and the gerrymandering, and all that stuff. Now, maybe things will sweep enough in 2018 or in 2020 that we'll be in a position to do that. But we have to have, by that time, a clear program of what the major things we have to do are. And I'd say almost the first thing is to end the financial power of the corporations by getting them out of politics. That's almost the first thing I would do. The second thing I would do is get a Medicare for All program in there immediately. The third thing I would do is pass the job guarantee program. The fourth thing I would do is turn to sustainability and climate change. And I'll tell you, the first three things I mentioned could be done inside of the first month, or even quicker than that. And then we'd immediately be focused on the climate change problem and putting together a Green New Deal, all the elements and all the aspects of a Green New Deal. Okay. And Mark Fabian says, in other words, jobs that would not be profitable for private business, but are needed by the community. Absolutely, Mark. That's what it would be like. Okay. Sandy Degg says, Joe Firestone for president. Well, I'll tell you, Sandy, I don't know if I could stand the rigors of a presidential campaign. I am 78. I'm 78 now. By the time the next election should roll around 2020, I'll be 81. And I think that Bernie would be able to run a much better campaign than I, and maybe some others that we don't really know fully about yet, who are not even on the horizon yet. We know there are many, many capable people out there, and many, many committed people out there, and many, many sincere people out there. And I think they're in a better position to run for president. And my lovely wife, Bonnie, is bringing me a very welcome glass of red wine in hopes that it will soon put me to sleep. But anyway, thank you for that vote of confidence, Sandy. I certainly appreciate it. I was a strange young man, and when I was in junior high school and high school, sometimes the teachers would ask me, as kind of an exercise, they go around the class, they'd ask everybody, what do you want to be when you grow up? And at least on 2 occasions, I answered, I'd like to be president of the United States. But when I got old enough, okay, I never did pursue that ambition because I think over time I had lost it. I had gotten so immersed in doing very interesting things with my mind, basically problem solving, that I no longer wanted to run for president. I wasn't that interested in the power. But I suppose Okay, in a way, when I saw things deteriorating so badly in the United States in the early 2000s, okay, and later, that kind of woke me up. Then I had to go back to my first love, which actually was politics. And Mark Fabian says, waving at Bonnie, hiya, Bonnie. Sandy says that I would make an awesome president. I don't know, Sandy. I'm not sure I have the necessary killer instinct. When I say killer instinct, I certainly don't mean in the sense of Donald Trump. Okay, but the best president of my lifetime, by far, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I was a boy when he was the president of the United States. So later on, when I was still a young man, of course, I read about his administration, okay, in detail. And there has just never been a president since then who came anywhere close to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He wasn't perfect. I know about all the mistakes he made. And I know about the flaws in his character. And I know about the superficiality of his intellect. But at the same time, for sheer energy and capacity to try different things and pragmatism, while holding on also to a certain degree, okay, of idealism. There was never a president like Franklin Roosevelt. I'd hold him up against George Washington and Abe Lincoln any day in the week. I don't think I can make a president like that. So anyway, thank you very much for your vote of confidence. And so Mark Fabian wants to see me in Congress. Well, again, to be in Congress is a very, very tough job. And I am 78. I love to talk to you. And I love to write books. And I love to be involved, okay, in activist efforts of one kind or another. And I think it's my time to do that. I think I've earned it. So, are there any other comments or questions before we say goodnight? Then I thank you for a very entertaining and strangely relaxing part of my evening. To put a real period on the conference so far for me, and I'm ready to move on to the last day of the conference tomorrow. Okay, and I hope that I'll have a special surprise for you tomorrow night. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Tricia. And I expect to see you tomorrow night because Steve won't be home in time for his usual program with Alice on a Sunday night. But I hope to have a surprise for you. So take care and bye.